That night, the queen, dressed in a simple nightgown that clung to her every curve, entered Juwon's chamber. She was beautiful, but her eyes were filled with sorrow. She did not want to be there, but she had no choice. Her son was dead, and Juwon was her only hope. Juwon, sensing her reluctance, began to speak to her in a soft, soothing voice. He told her how much he admired her beauty, how he had dreamed of this moment since he first saw her. He touched her gently, his fingers brushing against her skin in a way that made her shiver. He kissed her neck, whispering sweet words in her ear, promising her that he would bring her son back. He mentioned to her while rubbing her body with his hands that he knows her husband, the king, does not satisfy her. The queen tried to resist, but she was too desperate. She needed Juwon's power, and she would do anything to get it. Eventually, she succumbed to his touch, giving in to his demands. The king was restless. He could hear the moans of Juwon as he penetrated his wife. The king shed tears and rushed inside his hut, shut the door and tore his robe. He sat on the floor and cried like a baby. The pain made him take a knife and made away with his middle finger, saying, "I will not allow another man humiliate me without taking a revenge for it." The king then took his fine horse and rode out that night. The same event happened on the second night. The D-Day came, and all the king's men, elders, and palace representatives gathered to watch Juwon raise the dead prince. You see, Juwon usually deceives the onlookers by using them to place the body of the deceased on red stones and pour some native palm wine on the body to confuse them from the actual bracelet in his hands. So after all the preparation, the kings asked the guards to summon Juwon, but when he tried to use the bracelet power, nothing happened. The prince remained lifeless, his body cold and still. Juwon tried again and again and again, but the bracelet did not respond. Panic set in as he realized that the bracelet had lost its power. When the king learned that Juwon had failed to raise his son, his fury knew no bounds. He ordered his guards to seize Juwon and drag him to the dungeon. Juwon pleaded for his life, but the king was unmoved. He had lost his son, his pride as a king, and now Juwon would pay the price. The queen burst into tears and locked herself inside her chamber, instructing the guards to restrict everyone from seeing her, even the king. That night, the king's guards took Juwon to a dark, cold cell deep within the palace. They bound his hands and feet, and as dawn approached, they slaughtered him. Juwon's death was swift and brutal, and the news of his demise was hidden from the world. The king did not want a war with Juwon's kingdom, so he buried the secret along with his body. Juwon's death was not the end of this story. As his soul left his body, he found himself standing before the gate of the dead, a towering ancient structure that loomed over a desolate landscape. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the ground was littered with the bones of the doomed. Juwon approached the gate, but before he could pass through, he was confronted by the keeper of the gate, a figure cloaked in shadow. The keeper's voice was cold and hollow as he spoke. "Juwon," he said, "you have tampered with the natural order. You have brought the dead back to the living, and for that you must pay the price." Joan tried to explain himself, but the keeper was unmoved. He summoned the transporter to the great beyond, the guardian who ferried the souls of the righteous to their eternal rest. But when the transporter saw Joan, he recoiled in anger. "You have defied the will of the underworld," the transporter hissed. "You have taken souls that did not belong to you. The time zones have been disturbed, and you will pay for your crimes." The keeper then summoned the transporter to the burning kingdom and the realm where the souls of the wicked were condemned to eternal torment. The transporter, a fearsome creature with eyes that burned like fire, stared at Joan with contempt. "You are an abomination," he growled. "You have disrupted the balance between life and death. You will suffer for your arrogance." As Joan stood before the keepers of the underworld, trembling with fear, he suddenly heard a voice behind him. He turned to see the king's son, the very boy he had failed to rise, standing before him. "Joan," the boy said, his voice filled with anger, "you have failed me. You have failed my mother. But there is something you do not know." The boy's eyes burned with an unearthly light as he spoke. "My mother is pregnant, Joan. Pregnant with your child." You see, in part 1, Joan's wives could not conceive. None of his wives could bear him a child. That was part of the curse that the bracelet came with. But as she exchanged the bracelet, Joan's natural order was restored. That was why he could pregnant a woman, and now the king's wife, who was also not able to conceive due to complications of the prince's birth, had conceived due to Joan's potent and foul spirit. Joan's heart sank as the weight of the boy's words hit him. The revelation was like a cold dagger piercing his heart. How could this be? How could he have fathered a child in his quest for power and desire? The boy's eyes, once filled with the innocence of life, now glowed with the fury of the dead. "Your actions have consequences, Joan," the boy continued, his voice echoing with the power of the underworld. "You have taken lives that were meant to rest, and now you have brought a new life into the world, a life that will bear the cost of your sins." Joan fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the enormity of what he had done. But surprisingly, one would think Joan was sober. But the arrogant Joan, knowing how he wielded the power to raise the dead in the land of the living, spoke arrogantly. "I did not ask to be given the power. I did not ask to be chosen. I only went to hunt, and the power was bestowed upon me. I demand a fair trial to cross to the land of great beyond." The keepers of the underworld loomed over him, their voices rising in unison. "You have disturbed the balance of life and death, Joan, and for that you will be punished." Joan's heart pounded in his chest as the keepers revealed his fate. He would be sent back to the land of the living, but not as he once was. He will be caused to undo the damage he had done, to return every soul he had taken from the underworld back to their eternal rest. Only then, when he had restored the balance, would he be allowed to die. Joan was angry. He shouted and said, "You mean I should take back the lives of all the souls I have raised? Do you know how many souls I have raised? Do you have any idea?" But the keepers shouted like thunder at him and said, "You do not ask us questions. That is your punishment. You shall not find sleep as you return. You shall feel the weakness of your body, due to the sleepless day at night. He would get only 5 hours of sleep upon returning one's soul. As they spoke, a shiny glowing blue pendant rounded Juwon's neck. He struggled with it for a while, as the pendant was a powerful tool that had the numerous numbers of lives. He was denied natural order rest. Finally, Juwon's body was cold and lifeless when he awoke. He gasped for air, his lungs burning as if he had been underwater for too long. His heart pounded in his chest, and a deep thirst clawed at his throat. He was back in his own body, but he felt as if he had been torn apart and sewn back together. As he struggled to his feet, Juwon realized that he was still in the king's dungeon for 14 days, surrounded by the corpses of those who had wronged the king one way or another. The bracelet, the source of his power and his curse, still clung to his wrist, but it no longer glowed with the same unholy light. It was cold, lifeless, a reminder of the horrors he had unleashed. The pendant glowing in his neck, Juwon, deep in memory, remembered the words of the keeper of the underworld. You must wear this pendant on all the people whose lives you've raised and send them back to us. You must also do this before 77 days upon your return to the land of the living. Just as Juwon tried to get up from the corpses surrounding him, he saw a guard who screamed and ran away. What happens next when the king finds out that Juwon is back from the land of the dead? What happens to the pregnant queen? What happens to Juwon's task if not fulfilled? Find out in part 3. If you are enjoying this folktale series, drop a comment on the comment box to encourage us push more interesting stories to you. See you soon, guys. Bye.